The first time Nelson Wells sat alone on the eastern ridge of Redemption Flats, watching the sun bleed gold across a sky that had no business being that beautiful. He told himself that a man with hands as ruined as his had no right to reach for anything worth keeping. That was the spring of 1874, and Nelson had been in Redemption Flats for just under 3 weeks, long enough to rent a room above the hardware store from a stout man named Purdy, long enough to take a job mending fences on the outskirts of the Callaway Ranch, and long enough to understand that this town, like every other sun-baked, wind-scoured settlement scattered across the New Mexico territory, was full of people trying to outrun something. The difference, Nelson figured, was that most of them still had hope bundled somewhere inside their coat pockets. He had used his up a long time ago, somewhere back in the wreckage of a burned farmhouse outside of Abilene, Kansas, and a marriage that had dissolved not through cruelty, but through a slow, suffocating grief that neither he nor his late wife Clara had known how to name. Clara had died of a fever in the winter of 1871. She had been 26 years old, strong-limbed and clear-eyed, a woman who planted her garden with the same deliberate faith that a preacher plants his scripture. And then the fever came, as fevers do, without ceremony or permission, and she was gone in 11 days. Nelson had held her hand for all 11 of those days and nights, and when it was over, something inside of him went quiet in a way that 3 years had not been able to fix. He was 31 now. He had the kind of face that weather and sorrow carve character into dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, a jaw that was always a day past needing a shave, and eyes the color of deep creek water, green-gray and still. He was broad across the shoulders from years of ranch work, and he moved with the unhurried economy of a man who had learned that there was no point rushing toward anything. He had drifted south from Kansas through Indian Territory, through Texas, and finally into New Mexico, not following any particular dream but simply following the work. Fence mending, cattle driving, hauling supply wagons for merchants who needed strong arms and a man who asked no questions. He had been a reliable, capable, solitary man for 3 years now, and he had told himself, in all the ways a person can tell themselves something without quite speaking the words aloud, that this was simply who he was going to be now. A man who worked, a man who slept, a man who watched sunrises alone on ridges because there was nothing else to fill the early morning hours and the quiet was better than the alternative. Redemption Flats was not a large town. It had a main street that stretched perhaps 300 yards, lined with a general store, a blacksmith, the hardware store where Nelson rented his room, a small church that listed slightly to the south as though trying to look away from the saloon across the road, a doctor's office, a land office, and a livery stable. There was a small schoolhouse on the north edge of town that had been built the previous year with lumber hauled in from Santa Fe. The town had perhaps 200 souls in it, give or take the seasonal ranch hands who drifted through and the Navajo traders who came to the general store on Thursdays to trade blankets and silver for flour and sugar. The territory was still raw and new in the way that only frontier places can be, where the law was a man named Sheriff Aldous Crane who wore his badge like an apology, and where disputes were settled sometimes by the court and sometimes by the particular silence between two men standing in the road. Nelson liked the rawness of it. He liked that nobody in Redemption Flats knew his name well enough yet to ask him how he was doing with that particular tone of voice that people who knew about Clara used, the soft, careful tone that made him want to get on his horse and ride until the ground gave out. He spent his first weeks working from before sunrise until the light failed, mending sections of fence that had been broken by weather and wandering cattle along the eastern boundary of the Callaway spread. Old Hector Callaway was a fair man, weathered as saddle leather, who paid Nelson in coin at the end of each week and offered no conversation beyond what was strictly necessary, which suited Nelson fine. Hector's foreman, a lean Texan named Dubois with a silver tooth and a permanent squint, had looked Nelson over on his first day and said, "You done this kind of work before?" And when Nelson said yes, Dubois had nodded once and walked away, and that was the end of any orientation. It was the routine of the work that Nelson clung to. The rhythm of pulling wire, setting posts, the particular satisfaction of a fence line standing straight and true. Physical work was good for a man who did not want to think. His body would be tired by evening, his hands would be raw from the wire, and he could sleep without lying awake constructing conversations with a woman who was 3 years in the ground. He had been in Redemption Flats exactly 22 days when the stage from Santa Fe arrived on a Tuesday morning, carrying with it 3 barrels of nails for Purdy's hardware store, a crate of medical supplies for the doctor, several weeks' worth of mail, and a woman named Opal Blackwell. Nelson was crossing the main street on his way to buy a new pair of work gloves when the stage rolled in, and he had not intended to pay it any particular attention. He noticed the dust cloud first, then heard the driver calling the team down to a stop in front of the general store, and he was almost past before something made him glance over his shoulder. Later, he would not be able to explain what made him look. He simply looked. She stepped down from the stage without waiting for the driver to help her, which immediately set her apart from what Nelson might have expected. She was tall for a woman, with dark auburn hair pinned up under a traveling hat that had seen better days, and she wore a practical gray dress that was dusty from the road but well-made, the dress of a woman who knew the difference between what was sensible and what was not. She had a leather satchel over one shoulder and a carpet bag in her other hand, and she stood in the middle of the main street of Redemption Flats and looked at it with an expression that Nelson could not quite read from across the road. Not disappointment exactly, not despair. Something more like a woman taking accurate stock of a situation and deciding, in real time, what she thought of it. She was perhaps 27 or 28 years old, with a face that was pretty in the straightforward, unself-conscious way of a woman who had more important things to think about than her prettiness. Her eyes were dark, nearly black, and when she turned her head and swept the length of the main street with her gaze, those eyes moved with a focused intelligence that made Nelson think, involuntarily, that she was the most awake-looking person he had seen in a very long time. He made himself look away and went into the general store to buy his gloves. He did not think about her for the rest of the day. Or rather, he thought about her exactly twice, briefly and without much elaboration, the way you think about something you have filed under the category of none of your business. He found out who she was the next morning at breakfast in the small dining room attached to the boarding house 2 doors down from Purdy's, where a woman named Mrs. Hooper cooked beans and salt pork and strong coffee for the paying residents and anyone else who showed up with a coin and a civil tongue. Mrs. Hooper was a generous, broad woman who knew everything that happened in Redemption Flats approximately 45 minutes before it happened, and she was explaining to the room in general, though there were only 3 other people besides Nelson present, that the woman who had arrived on Tuesday's stage was a schoolteacher. "Name's Blackwell, Mrs. Hooper said, setting a plate in front of Nelson with the authority of a woman who considered feeding people an act of moral significance. "Opal Blackwell. She comes from Taos. The school board hired her by letter back in January, and she's finally made it down. Apparently the stage got delayed twice from Santa Fe on account of a washed-out section of road. She's staying here?" asked one of the other men, a gray-bearded freight agent named Cooley who ate at Mrs. Hooper's every morning. "She is," Mrs. Hooper said, with the satisfaction of a woman announcing something good. "She took the upstairs room at the end. Already asked me where she could find a broom, which I appreciate in a person." Nelson drank his coffee and said nothing, and later walked out to the Callaway Ranch and spent the day mending fence and thinking about nothing in particular. The schoolhouse was on the north edge of town, which meant that the route Opal Blackwell walked each morning took her past the front of Purdy's hardware store, where Nelson sat on the bench outside for approximately 15 minutes each morning, while he laced his work boots before collecting his horse from the livery. He noticed her on Thursday, walking briskly with her satchel over her shoulder and her hair pinned up under the same battered hat, and he gave her a nod in the way you give anyone a nod on a small-town street, and she returned it with a directness that surprised him slightly, a nod that looked you in the eye rather than slightly to the left of it. On Friday she stopped. Not because of him, he understood immediately. She stopped because one of the laces on her boots had come undone, and she set her satchel on the bench beside him without ceremony and bent to lace it up, and then straightened and picked up her satchel and looked at him. "You work for the Callaways," she said. It was not a question. "I do," he said. "Mrs. Hooper mentioned it. She mentioned most things about most people over supper last night." There was a small, dry note in her voice that was not unkindness but something closer to candid amusement, and Nelson found his mouth shifting into something that was almost a smile before he consciously approved of it. "That sounds like Mrs. Hooper," he said. "I'm Opal Blackwell," she said. "I'm starting at the schoolhouse Monday." "Nelson Wells," he said. "Welcome to Redemption Flats." She looked at the main street for a moment at its particular brand of dust and function and said, "It seems like an honest place." "It does its best," he said. She gave another of those direct nods, picked up her satchel, and walked on toward the schoolhouse, and Nelson watched the road for a moment after she had gone and then bent to finish lacing his own boots and told himself firmly that a woman like that was not something he was going to think about. He thought about her all the way to the Callaway Ranch. The thing about Redemption Flats was that it was small enough that avoiding someone took deliberate effort, and Nelson was not the sort of man who put effort into avoiding things. He simply tried not to pursue them, which was a different thing entirely. But Opal Blackwell had a quality that made not thinking about her slightly more difficult than he had anticipated. She was not loud about it. She did not seek attention. She simply went about the business of setting up her schoolhouse with a focused energy that was visible all over town in small ways. She organized a meeting with the school board, which consisted of 3 men including Hector Callaway, to discuss the curriculum. She spent 2 Saturdays cleaning the schoolhouse from floor to ceiling and rehanging the door that had sagged on its hinges all winter. She went to the general store and made a list of supplies she needed, and had a careful, practical conversation with the store's owner, Mr. Tate, about what could be ordered from Santa Fe. Nelson heard these things from Mrs. Hooper and from Dubois, who mentioned that Miss Blackwell had been at the Callaway Ranch for the school board meeting and had stood at the head of the parlor room and outlined what she intended to teach, and in what order, with the unflinching calm of someone who knew exactly what they were doing. Hector liked her, Dubois said, which from Hector Callaway's foreman was roughly equivalent to a declaration of canonization. The schoolhouse opened on the second Monday of April, and Redemption Flats sent its children, some 23 of them ranging from 6 to 14, through the door with the particular mix of reluctance and relief that parents in a frontier town display when they hand their children over to education. Nelson saw the children going in that morning when he was riding out to the ranch. He slowed his horse slightly as he passed, and he could hear, through the open window, Opal Blackwell's voice beginning the day with a clear, unhurried authority that carried without shouting. He rode on. It was at the end of the 3rd week of April that everything shifted, though at the time it felt like nothing more than a chance encounter shaped by bad timing. Nelson had stayed late at the Callaway Ranch that evening repairing a section of fence that had collapsed when one of the yearling bulls had gone through it in a temper, and by the time he rode back toward town, it was full dark, the kind of dark the New Mexico Territory did with particular conviction, stars scattered so thick and low they looked like someone had spilled flour across a black tablecloth. He was tired and his hands ached, and he was thinking about nothing more complicated than his bed when he came around the south curve of the main road and saw a figure sitting on the low wall of the horse trough at the edge of town. He would have ridden past, but the figure was sitting with her head bent and her hands flat on her knees in the posture of someone not resting but enduring, and something about it made him pull his horse up. It was Opal. The hat was in her lap, and her hair had come partially loose, and she was looking at the ground with an expression that was controlled in the way that means a person has been working very hard at being controlled for quite some time. He hesitated, which was unusual for him. He was not a man who hesitated, but he sat on his horse for a moment in the dark and weighed the competing merits of leaving her to her privacy against the simpler, more stubborn instinct that told him it was wrong to ride past a woman sitting alone in the dark at the edge of a frontier town looking like that. He swung down from his horse and walked over and stood near the trough, not crowding her, holding his reins in one hand. "Miss Blackwell," he said, "everything all right?" She looked up, and in the darkness her face was composed again in the moment before he could read what had been on it. "Mr. Wells," she said, "yes, I just needed some air." "It's pretty late for sitting outside," he said, not accusingly, just as a statement of fact. She looked at the road for a moment. Then she said, "I received a letter today, from Taos, an old friend of mine who I was expecting news from." She paused. The news was not good. He did not ask what kind of news. He simply stood there in the way that a person who has had their own bad news delivered knows how to stand without filling the silence with noise. After a moment she said, "Someone I was very fond of has died, an older woman. She was something of a mentor to me, the one who encouraged me to pursue teaching in the first place." She smoothed her dress across her knees in a gesture that was half composed, half grieving. "I suppose I needed to sit somewhere that wasn't my room." "I understand that," Nelson said. And he said it simply, without performance, because he did understand it with a thoroughness that came from lived experience and not from any skill with comforting words. Something in how he said it made her look at him more carefully in the dim light. "Did you lose someone?" she asked, and it was a direct question but not a presumptuous one. It was the kind of question a perceptive person asks when they recognize the sound of their own experience in someone else's voice. "My wife," he said, 3 years ago." A beat of silence. "I'm sorry," she said, and she meant it with the same simplicity he had used. "Thank you," he said. And then, because it seemed like the right thing and because he was not a man who spoke easily but he was a man who was honest, he said, "It doesn't go away, but it gets quieter, slowly." She looked at him for a moment, and in that look something was exchanged that was wordless and entirely real, the recognition between two people who have both sat in the particular dark that grief makes. "Sit down if you like," she said. "I'm not quite ready to go back in." He tied his horse loosely to the post by the trough and sat on the wall a few feet from her, not close enough to presume anything, just close enough to be company. They sat for perhaps 20 minutes. They talked a little, about nothing much, about the way the stars were different down here than further north, about how the town was quieter than either of them had expected after dark. He told her about the bull that had gone through the fence, and she told him about the boy in her school named Thomas who had come in that morning with a horned toad in his jacket pocket and presented it to her as a gift, and the telling of it brought a small, genuine laugh out of her that he suspected she needed and she might not have known she needed. When she stood to go in, she said, "Thank you, Mr. Wells, for stopping." "Nelson," he said, because Mr. Wells sounded like someone else. She gave a small, honest smile. "Thank you, Nelson." He rode his horse to the livery and brushed him down and walked back to his room above the hardware store, and he lay on his back in the dark and stared at the ceiling and understood that he was in a significant amount of trouble. May arrived and stretched itself long and golden across the territory. The work at the Callaway Ranch shifted from fence mending to the seasonal labor of the spring roundup, which meant longer days and harder riding, gathering cattle scattered across the grazing land and bringing them in to be branded. Nelson worked alongside Dubois and 3 other ranch hands, including a young Mexican vaquero named Emilio who was 20 years old and could throw a rope with a precision that Nelson found genuinely impressive to watch. Emilio had the unfailing cheerfulness of a young man who had not yet had enough taken from him to learn caution, and he liked Nelson immediately and completely. The way young people sometimes decide about older people without requiring any courtship of the decision. "You are quiet," Emilio told Nelson on their second day of roundup, riding beside him across a stretch of dry grassland. "I've been told," Nelson said. "It is not bad," Emilio said, with the magnanimity of someone bestowing approval. "But it is notable." Nelson looked at him. "You're barely old enough to shave and you're analyzing my character." "I have 4 older brothers," Emilio said cheerfully. "I have been analyzing character my whole life." Nelson snorted, which was as close to a laugh as he generally got in those days, and Emilio accepted it as a victory. The schoolhouse let out in the early afternoon, and it became a fact of life in Redemption Flats that around 3 o'clock on weekday afternoons, if you were near the north end of town, you would see Opal Blackwell emerge from the schoolhouse and walk toward the general store or the post office or Mrs. Hooper's, depending on the day. She was becoming part of the town's fabric in the way that people who belong somewhere do, recognizable and steady, someone who children waved at in the street, and whose name was spoken by the merchants with a particular easy familiarity that takes months to earn and means everything once it is given. Nelson began, quietly and without announcement to himself, to find reasons to be in the center of town around 3 o'clock on certain days. He would tell himself he needed something from the general store. He needed to check for mail at the post office. He needed to ask Purdy about a particular tool. And sometimes these things were true, and sometimes they were only partially true, and sometimes they were not true at all. But the result was that he would see her crossing the street or stepping out of the store, and they would exchange a word or two, and something in his chest would do a thing he did not have a word for anymore, because he had retired the vocabulary for it 3 years ago. He knew it was dangerous. He knew himself well enough to know that. He was not a young man who did not understand the territory he was moving through. He was 31 years old and he had lost someone, and he had rebuilt himself on the quiet premise that he would not need to survive that kind of loss again, and the simplest way to guarantee that was to not acquire anything that could be lost. It was not a philosophy he was proud of. It was just the arrangement he had come to. But Opal Blackwell was making it complicated. She was not making it complicated in any obvious way. She was simply herself, consistently and without calculation, and the particular quality of her selfhood kept asserting itself against the careful architecture of his detachment. She was funny, in the dry, observational way of a person who noticed things precisely, and found the gap between how things presented themselves and how they actually were to be a source of genuine amusement. She was kind without being soft, the way a woman who has made practical choices about a practical life learns to be. She spoke honestly and expected honesty in return, and when she looked at you, not at the space above your shoulder or at the comfortable middle distance, but at you. He found out more about her over the course of May in the way you find out about people in a small town, gradually and from multiple sources. Mrs. Hooper was the most reliable. Opal had grown up in Virginia, the daughter of a schoolteacher father who had died when she was 17, leaving her and her mother in difficult circumstances. She had worked as a seamstress's assistant, and then as a teacher's aide, and then earned her certificate to teach. She had come west 2 years ago to Taos because there was work for teachers in the territory, and because, as Mrs. Hooper reported with something like admiration, she had wanted to. She had no husband and had never had one, which Mrs. Hooper relayed not as gossip but as a fact to be considered respectfully, because Opal was the sort of woman who made you understand without saying it directly that she had chosen her path and was not apologetic about any turn of it. Nelson thought about her in the evenings when he was too tired to stop himself from thinking about anything and not tired enough to sleep. He thought about the way she had sat on the horse trough wall in the dark and held her grief like a stone in her hands instead of throwing it at anyone. He thought about the way she said his name, not Nelson in the deferential way some people said it, as though the name was doing them a favor, but Nelson in the straightforward way of a woman who thought names were simply names and people were simply people. He thought about Clara too. He thought about her more often now than he had in the past year, though not in the agonized way of the early grief. More in the way you think about a place you have lived and loved and left, a kind of tender, specific remembering that did not cut as much as it used to. He thought about what Clara would have thought of Opal Blackwell. Clara had been a woman of strong, immediate opinions. He thought she probably would have liked her. He thought she probably would have said something brisk and accurate about both of them from her particular vantage point of having known Nelson at his worst and best. The thought made him feel something he could not quite categorize. Sad and grateful and slightly less alone, all at once. It was Emilio who finally said it out loud, on a late May evening when the roundup was winding down and the two of them were riding back toward the ranch house in the copper light of late afternoon. "The teacher," Emilio said, with the casual profundity of the young. "Miss Blackwell. You look at her the way my father looks at the mountains when he thinks no one is watching." Nelson kept his eyes on the road. "I don't know what that means." "Yes, you do," Emilio said pleasantly. A long silence stretched between them, filled with the sound of horses and the dry, warm wind. "It doesn't matter how I look at anyone," Nelson said finally. "Some things are not for everyone." Emilio considered this for a moment with the seriousness it apparently deserved. "My grandmother," he said. "She lost my grandfather when my father was only 6 years old. 20 years she was a widow. And then she met a man at a harvest festival in the village, a man who had also lost someone, and they were married within the year and they had 8 more years together before she died. She told my father that those 8 years were not less than the years she had before. They were just different and they were hers." Nelson was quiet for a long time after that. "Your grandmother tell you that story specifically to give to people you thought needed it?" he asked. Emilio grinned. "She told everyone everything. It was one of her gifts." The last week of May brought a heat that settled over the territory like a heavy blanket and did not move. And with it came a dust storm on a Wednesday afternoon that rolled in off the desert to the west and turned the sky brown and sent everything in Redemption Flats scrambling for shelter. Nelson was riding back from the Callaway Ranch when the storm hit, and he made the livery stable with his horse just as the full force of it arrived, the wind screaming at a pitch that made the building shudder, the air so thick with grit that you could not see 3 feet ahead. He waited in the livery with the horses for an hour while the storm passed, and when it finally moved on and the air cleared to a hazy, gritty amber, he walked out into the main street to find Redemption Flats looking as though someone had thrown a bucket of sand over every surface. The town was slowly emerging, people opening doors and assessing damage, and he was helping a woman named Mrs. Tate write a display of goods that had blown off the front porch of the general store when he heard a sound from the direction of the schoolhouse and looked up. Opal was standing in front of the schoolhouse, which had lost a section of its front window to the wind. The window frame had blown out and glass was scattered across the front step and the dry ground in front of it. She was standing with her hands on her hips, assessing the damage with the same level practical expression she might have given a difficult arithmetic problem, already calculating what needed to be done. Nelson set the last of Mrs. Tate's display upright and walked over. "The window frame," he said, looking at it. "I can fix that. I'll need some lumber and glass from Purdy's." She looked at him. "You don't have to do that." "I know," he said. "But if you leave it open until the school board arranges for someone to fix it, the interior of the school will be full of dust for a week. I can have it done before dark." She looked at the window for a moment and then at him. "I'll pay you for the materials." "We can argue about that after," he said. He spent the rest of that afternoon repairing the window frame, and she stayed and helped, not in a decorative way but practically, holding boards while he nailed them, handing him tools from the bag he had brought from Purdy's with the efficiency of someone who was not afraid of physical work. They talked while they worked, easy conversation that moved from the storm to the school to the territory's particular weather to what it had been like for her to grow up in Virginia and how different the landscape here was from anything she had ever known. "It's unforgiving," she said, holding a corner brace while he nailed it. "The land, but I don't think I mean that as a criticism. I think I mean it as respect." "That's about right," he said. "It doesn't tolerate anything unnecessary," she said. "I find I like that." He fitted the new glass pane into the frame and pressed the putty into the seam and stepped back to look at it. The light was going gold and low, and the schoolhouse with its fresh repaired window looked somehow better for having been broken and mended. "Thank you," she said. She said it the way she said things, directly and without performance. "It was nothing," he said. "It was not nothing," she said simply, and looked at him until he acknowledged it with a nod. They walked back toward the center of town together because it was the same direction, and the evening was settling in cool and quiet after the storm, the air washed clean. When they reached the front of Purdy's hardware store, they stopped, because her road to Mrs. Hooper's went left and his went in. She looked at him for a moment with that dark, direct gaze, and she said, "I noticed you've taken to being in the center of town around 3 o'clock some afternoons." He felt something shift in his chest, which he recognized as the physical manifestation of having been seen. He was quiet for a moment. "I've had errands," he said. "You have," she agreed, with a small, honest smile. "Though I notice the errands seem to cluster on the days the weather is pleasant." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the evening light was the color of honey, and he said, "I owe you an apology, I think, if that's made you uncomfortable." "It hasn't," she said. And then, after a brief pause that seemed to contain a decision, "I'll walk in the afternoons on the west side of the street on Tuesdays and Thursdays. The shade is better over there." She picked up her satchel. "Good evening, Nelson." She walked away, and he stood in front of Purdy's hardware store for a moment in the warm evening air and felt something in his chest that was unmistakably, uncomplicatedly, terrifyingly hope. June in the New Mexico territory smelled like sage and warm earth, and the particular dusty sweetness of the desert when it remembered rain. Nelson worked and watched the Tuesdays and Thursdays arrive with an attentiveness he had not given to the passage of time in 3 years, and he walked on the west side of the street in the afternoons, and their encounters extended from 2 minutes to 10, to sometimes as long as half an hour, drifting along the main street together in the way of people who are manufacturing reasons to keep walking in the same direction. She told him about her teaching, the specific shapes of the children's learning, which ones were bright and struggling against it, and which ones were steady, and which ones had a talent for something particular. There was a girl named Rosie who could do mathematics in her head faster than Opal could do it on paper. There was the boy Thomas of the horned toad who could not sit still for reading, but who could tell you everything about the geography of the territory from memory, having absorbed it from his father's surveying work. She spoke about them with a warm, specific affection that was not sentimental but was something better, which was deeply real. He told her things he had not talked about in a long time. He told her about growing up in Illinois, the son of a farmer who was a good man and a mediocre farmer, a combination that had kept the family honest and lean. He told her about the farm in Kansas that he and Clara had tried to build together, the specific stubbornness it had taken to break ground on that particular stretch of land, and the way Clara had laughed at the stubborn wickedness of the soil with a laugh that he had loved unreasonably. He said Clara's name, and it did not come out broken, which surprised him. It came out the way any name comes out when you are speaking of someone who mattered and who you have made your peace with carrying. Opal listened the way a good listener listens, which is to say she actually listened, not waiting for the space to speak, but taking in what was said and letting it matter. "She sounds like someone who deserved better than 11 days, Opal said quietly after he had told her about the fever. "She deserved 40 years, he said, at least. "And you deserved them with her," Opal said, not as a consolation, just as a fact spoken plainly. He looked at the road ahead of them for a moment. "I thought for a long time that the way to honor that was to not ask for anything again. Does that make sense?" She was quiet for a beat. "It makes the kind of sense that grief makes," she said, "which is its own kind of sense, even when it isn't quite right." He looked at her. "I'm not saying you're wrong," she said quickly. "I'm just saying I don't know if closing yourself off is the same as honoring someone. Maybe she would have wanted more than that for you." He did not answer right away. They had reached the end of the main street, where the buildings gave way to the open desert fringe, and they stopped at the natural boundary of the town's walkable center. "Maybe she would have," he said finally. "I'm not sure I know how to want things anymore. I'm not sure that particular machinery still works." She looked at him with those dark, honest eyes and said, "It works. I suspect you're just afraid to find out." He stood with that for a moment. A bird called somewhere in the scrub brush at the edge of the road. "You're not a woman who minces words," he said. "I tried it once," she said. "It seemed inefficient." He laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, a laugh that came from somewhere he had forgotten was still available, and the sound of it seemed to surprise them both slightly in the warm June evening. She was smiling at him when he looked at her again, a full smile this time, unguarded and warm, and something in his chest did the thing that it had been doing in small ways for weeks, but this time it did it decisively, unmistakably, with the finality of a door that has been closed for a long time opening all the way. It was the end of June when he gathered himself and asked her, which did not feel like courage exactly, but felt like the decision to be brave about something he had been cowardly about for long enough. He had thought about how to do it for several days, and had dismissed most of the options as either too formal or too casual, and had eventually decided that the only thing he knew how to be was direct, because that was the only thing he had found she consistently respected in other people, and he was fairly certain it was what he respected in her. He waited until a Thursday afternoon when they had done their customary walk and were standing at the natural end of it at the edge of the street, and he said, "I'd like to take you to dinner. The hotel in town does a proper meal on Friday evenings, or so Mrs. Hooper tells me. I'd like to take you if you're willing." She looked at him for a moment that was not quite long but felt meaningful. "I am willing," she said. "Yes." It was as simple as that, and also as complicated as anything. The hotel was a two-story building on the east end of the main street called the Sutton House, run by a stout, efficient man named Gerhardt Sutton and his wife, who did the cooking. On Friday evenings, they put linen on the tables in the small dining room, which usually smelled like the stables next door, but made a genuine effort to be something finer one night a week, and served a meal of roasted meat and vegetables and bread that was an honest and respectable performance of civilization in a place that was still making civilization up as it went. Nelson had cleaned his best clothes with an attention to detail that he had not applied to anything sartorial in years. He wore his good dark shirt and his cleanest trousers, and had his boots properly blacked, and he was waiting in front of Mrs. Hooper's at 7 o'clock when Opal came down. She had changed her dress to a deep blue one he had not seen before, simpler than what a woman back east might wear to a dinner but clean and well-fitting, and the color of it made the darkness of her hair and eyes something to look at. And she had done something careful with her hair that he could not have described, but that registered as thoughtful. She looked, in sum, like a woman who had taken the occasion seriously and also like herself, which was exactly right. "You look very fine," he said, and he said it the way he said things, simply and meaning it entirely. "Thank you," she said. "So do you." They walked to the Sutton house through the warm June evening, and Gerhardt Sutton seated them at a corner table with something very close to ceremony, and Mrs. Sutton brought them roasted lamb and potatoes and carrots, and a bread that was soft in the middle and crusty on top, and they sat across from each other in the candlelight, which was real candlelight from real candles in real holders, because the Suttons believed that this detail was worth the expense. They talked for 2 hours. They talked about everything and nothing, about her plans for the fall school session, and about the history of the territory, and about what they each found beautiful about the land out here and about books, because she read with a hunger that matched his own, and they had both read some of the same ones and disagreed pleasantly about certain of them. He had forgotten what it was like to have a conversation that filled the space completely, that left no awkward silences needing to be papered over, that moved from topic to topic with the ease of two people who genuinely wanted to hear what the other one thought. When they were finishing the last of the bread, she said, "Can I ask you something direct?" "You've been asking me things directly for 2 months," he said. "I don't think you need to ask permission." "Fair," she said. "Do you think this scares you, this specifically, sitting here?" He considered that for a moment with the honesty it deserved. "Yes," he said, "more than I expected it to." "Does the being scared make you want to stop?" she asked, not challengingly, just wanting to know. He looked at her across the table, at this woman with her dark eyes and her direct heart and her willingness to ask the real questions, and he said, "No, it does not." She held his gaze for a moment, and then she smiled, the full honest one, and said, "Good." They walked back toward Mrs. Hooper's in the evening dark, and at the door of the boarding house he took her hand and held it briefly, just her hand in his for a moment, and she let him. And when he released it, they looked at each other, and the look contained a promise that neither of them put words to because it did not need them yet. "Good night, Nelson," she said. "Good night, Opal," he said, and her name in his mouth felt like something he had been given the right to. July came in like a hammer. The heat was serious and absolute, the kind of heat that makes the New Mexico territory feel like the inside of a kiln, and the land baked and cracked, and the creek on the south edge of town dropped to a trickle. The school was out of session for the summer, which meant Opal had time on her hands that she put to use in the way that was characteristic of her, visiting families in town, helping Mrs. Hooper with the boarding house garden, conducting an informal reading circle on Wednesday evenings in the library corner of the general store that Mr. Tate had cleared for the purpose. Nelson and Opal found more time together. They fell into a pattern that was its own kind of language, the language of two people learning each other. On Sunday mornings, when Nelson was not needed at the ranch and she was between her week's preparations, they would walk out to the eastern ridge before the heat of the day set in, the place where Nelson had sat alone in the early spring watching the sunrises. He had brought her there first almost by accident, suggesting it one Sunday when she had said she had not yet walked to the edge of the town's settled land. And when she had seen the view, she had been quiet for a long moment in the way that meant she was receiving something rather than simply observing it. The view from the eastern ridge was the kind of view that the territory offered as though making an argument for itself. A vast sweep of land folded and colored in ochre and rust and sage green, the sky above it enormous and frequently spectacular. And in the early morning, the sunrise came over the distant mountains in layers of color that changed from minute to minute, amber to pink to gold to the white blue of full morning. They began to come there most Sunday mornings. They would bring coffee in tin cups from Mrs. Hooper's kitchen, which Mrs. Hooper permitted with the knowing generosity of a woman who was watching something good unfold and considered herself a silent participant. They would sit on the flat boulder at the top of the ridge and watch the light come and talk, or not talk, and both were comfortable because they had reached the place in knowing each other where silence did not need filling. It was on the eastern ridge, on a Sunday morning in mid-July when the sunrise was particularly extravagant, all deep orange and rose gold bleeding up from behind the mountains, that Nelson understood with absolute clarity that he was in love with Opal Blackwell, and that this fact was not frightening in the way he had expected it to be. It was, in fact, the clearest thing he had felt in 3 years, as though the clarity of the morning air and the clarity of what he felt were made of the same substance. He looked at her sitting beside him on the flat rock, her coffee cup in both hands, her hat off because there was no one else to see, and the early light was doing something remarkable to the dark red of her hair. And he thought, with a completeness that left no room for argument, that this woman beside him was one of the finest people he had ever had the privilege of sitting next to, and that he wanted to go on sitting next to her for the rest of his mornings. He did not say it that day. He was building toward it the way you build toward something that matters with care. What he said instead was, "I'm glad I stopped that night when you were at the horse trough." She turned to look at him. The sunrise light was full on her face. "So am I," she said. "I almost didn't," he said. "I had decided not to trouble anyone." "You have a habit of deciding that," she said gently. "I know," he said. "I'm trying to decide differently." She looked at him with the warm honesty that was so entirely herself, and she reached over and put her hand over his where it rested on the rock, not grasping it, just placing it there, warm and sure. And they sat like that and watched the rest of the sunrise come in together, and it was one of the better mornings he had had in a very long time. The last week of July brought trouble to Redemption Flats that had nothing to do with weather or romance, and it announced itself in the form of a man named Curtis Hale. Curtis Hale arrived on the Tuesday stage, which in retrospect seemed like the stage had poor editorial judgment that week. He was a heavy-set man with a blonde mustache and the particular confidence of someone who had learned at some point that being large and loud was a workable substitute for having the right on your side. He was a land speculator, which in 1874 in the New Mexico Territory meant a man who read the land surveys and identified parcels that had unclear or disputed ownership, and then pursued those parcels with the tools available, which sometimes included lawyers and sometimes included other, less clean instruments. Hale had his eye on a stretch of grazing land on the eastern boundary of the territory, land that had been used by Navajo families for grazing for generations, and that had never been formally registered under the recent Land Acts, which created a gap in the documentation that Hale intended to exploit. Nelson found out about it from Hector Calloway, who was on the town council and who had received a formal inquiry from Hale's legal representative in Santa Fe about the land in question. Hector, who was a blunt man with strong opinions about what was right and what was not, was furious in the contained way of a man who saves his fury for actual use. "He'll file a claim," Hector said, sitting on his porch with Nelson and Dubois on a Wednesday evening after the ranch work was done. "He'll file it under the federal Land Acts, and the families who have used that land will have no standing because they didn't know they needed to register it. That's what men like Hale do. They find the gap in the law and they walk through it." Nelson knew about this. He had seen it before, in Kansas and in Texas, the advancing machinery of formal land ownership grinding over arrangements that had existed for decades and that were real and right even if they were not documented. It was one of the particular injustices of the territory, the way the law's paperwork moved faster than the people it affected could respond, and the damage done was permanent and lasting. Whole communities displaced by the movement of ink on federal forms. "What can be done?" he asked. Hector leaned back in his chair. "The families could file their own claim under the homestead provisions. It would give them legal standing. But they'd need someone to help them navigate the land office paperwork, and they'd need to do it before Hale's claim is processed, which gives us maybe 3 weeks. "I know someone at the land office in Santa Fe," Dubois said, "from my years in Texas, a fair man. He might be able to slow Hale's filing if the counterclaim is in motion." They looked at each other in the way of men who have decided something. Nelson spent the next several days riding out with Hector and a Navajo man named Chi, who spoke English well and who had been one of the Thursday traders at the general store for years, to the families whose use of the land was at stake. There were 3 extended family groups who grazed sheep on that eastern stretch, and explaining the situation required care and honesty, and the kind of translation that was not just about language, but about explaining the mechanics of a legal system that had been designed, very often, without any regard for the people it affected. Opal heard about it from Nelson on a Tuesday afternoon walk, and within 24 hours she had gone with Mrs. Hooper to 2 of the families to offer help with the practical things, food and supplies, while the men dealt with the legal filings. She also, characteristically, went to the land office in Redemption Flats and asked, politely, and with the focused precision of a woman who knew how to make a question feel like an inevitability, exactly what the process for a counterclaim required and what documentation would be necessary. The land office clerk, a young man named Finney who was 23 and professionally committed to being unhelpful, found himself providing a detailed explanation within 10 minutes of Opal sitting across his desk and looking at him with the specific, reasonable patience of a woman who clearly had all day and intended to use it. "You are something to see when you've made up your mind," Nelson told her afterward. "I simply asked questions," she said, "very many of them." Between Hector's connections, Dubois' contact in Santa Fe, the counterclaims filed by the families through the land office process that Opal had helped clarify, and a formal letter of objection signed by a considerable portion of Redemption Flats citizenry and sent to the Territorial Land Commission, Curtis Hale's claim ran into enough official friction that by the middle of August it had been delayed for review, and Hale himself, finding the territory less tractable than he had hoped, departed on the stage back to Santa Fe and was not seen again in Redemption Flats. The counterclaims were eventually approved, and the land remained in use by the families who had always used it. It was not a perfect resolution. Nelson knew that. These things were never perfectly resolved. The machinery of dispossession was large and patient, and it would try again somewhere else with different paperwork and different names. But this time in this place with these people it had been stopped, and that was worth something real. Hector shook Nelson's hand after the news came from Santa Fe. "You did good work," the old man said. "So did you," Nelson said. "So did a lot of people." "That's how it tends to work," Hector agreed. August moved toward its end, and the heat began to ease by small degrees, the evenings coming in cooler and the mornings returning a promise of something gentler ahead. The school year was approaching again, and Opal was deep in her preparations, and Nelson could see in her a particular energized quality that the prospect of the school year's beginning produced, the same way certain people light up when they are pointed toward the thing they are built for. He had been working up to saying the thing he had known he needed to say since the morning on the eastern ridge in July. He was not, by nature, a man who found declarations easy. He was a man who showed things through his actions and who trusted that actions were a reasonable language. But he had come to understand, in knowing Opal Blackwell, that while she did indeed read actions with excellent accuracy, she also valued the spoken thing, the courage of putting the real word to the real feeling, and that this was not weakness but its own kind of honesty. He did it on a Sunday morning on the eastern ridge, because it seemed right to do it there. The sunrise was quieter that morning, a steady, warm gold that came up without drama, the sky clearing from deep blue to a pale, luminous amber over the mountains. They had their coffee and they had been talking about the book she had ordered from Santa Fe that had finally arrived, and there was a pause in the conversation that was entirely comfortable, and he looked at her profile against the morning light and thought, simply and completely, now. "Opal," he said. She turned to look at him. "I want to tell you something," he said, "and I want to tell you honestly because I think that's the only way worth doing it." "All right," she said, and her voice was quiet and she gave him the full attention that was so characteristic of her. "I came to Redemption Flats not expecting anything," he said. "I'd stopped expecting things. I thought that was wisdom. I thought it was what I owed to what I'd lost and what I'd survived." He paused, choosing the words with care. "I was wrong about that, I think, or at least I was only partly right. Because the past few months, being near you, knowing you, it's shown me that what I thought was wisdom was mostly just fear, and I'm not entirely cured of it. But I know that I love you, Opal. I know it the way I know the things that are true and solid and real, and I'm asking if you're willing to see where that can go." The silence after he said it was not uncomfortable, but it was full, dense with the weight of what had been said, and what was being considered. She looked at him for a moment with those dark, steady eyes, and then she set her coffee cup on the rock beside her and she said, "Nelson, I have been waiting for you to say that for approximately 2 months." He felt something unknot in his chest. 2 months, he said. Since the middle of June, she said. I could have said it first, but I thought it was important that you came to it yourself, because of what it cost you to get here. It did cost something, he agreed. I know, she said. And I honor that it did. She looked at him with the clear, honest warmth that he had come to understand was one of the great gifts of who she was. I love you too. I have for some time. And I am very much willing to see where it goes. He reached over and took her hand properly this time, his hand wrapped around hers, and she turned her palm and held his back, and they sat on the flat boulder on the eastern ridge in the morning light, and the territory spread out before them vast and golden and entirely alive, and it was the best morning he had had in years. It might have been the best one he could remember. They were courting in the full, acknowledged sense from that point forward, which in Redemption Flats in 1874 meant that everyone knew about it approximately immediately. Mrs. Hooper did not pretend she did not know. Emilio, when Nelson told him, threw his hat in the air and said something joyful in Spanish that Nelson could not fully translate but understood the meaning of. Hector Calloway said, with the profound economy of the man, "Good," and that was the end of his commentary. Even Sheriff Crane, who had approximately 12 words of social conversation in his entire repertoire, managed to produce something close to a smile when he passed them on the street one afternoon walking together. They spent September in the particular sweet, unhurried happiness of two people who have come to love each other across an honest journey, and have no need to rush now that they have arrived. They walked and talked and sat on the ridge on Sunday mornings and had dinner at the Sutton house on Friday evenings, and he met her at the schoolhouse in the late afternoons and walked her back through the cooler September air that smelled like turned earth and the faint, clean approaching cold of autumn. He thought about Clara less now, though the thinking about her was not replaced by nothing, but by something that felt like gratitude, as though the love he had carried for her had done the work of teaching him how to love, and was now allowing him the use of what it had taught. He spoke to Opal about Clara again, more fully this time, not just the facts of the fever but the actual shape of who Clara had been, her laugh, her particular stubbornness about the garden, the way she sang off-key while she worked and was entirely cheerful about it. He spoke about her the way you speak about someone you have loved and lost and integrated, where the loss is real and permanent, and also no longer the only truth of who they were to you. Opal listened, and at the end she said, "She sounds like someone I would have liked." "I think she would have liked you," he said. She had very strong opinions about people who were honest and did not make excuses. "I'll take that as a compliment," Opal said. "It is one," he said. Entirely. October arrived, and with it the first genuine cold of the season, the kind that came down off the mountains at night and made the mornings sharp and clean. The trees at the edges of the creek turned, and the light changed to something more slanted and amber, and the territory, which had been so vast and hot and open all summer, seemed to gather itself into something crisper and more particular. Nelson had been thinking about the question he wanted to ask. He had been thinking about it for several weeks with a steadiness that was different from the anxiety he might have expected, and was instead something closer to certainty building toward the moment of its expression. He knew that he wanted to marry Opal Blackwell. He knew it with the same clarity with which he knew other fundamental things, the quality of the soil on the Callaway Range, the direction of the wind before a storm, the particular sound of the creek when it was running full. These were not things he doubted. They were things he knew. He also knew that marriage was a conversation before it was a ceremony. He had already had several of those conversations, in oblique and then less oblique ways. He had told her that he thought he was done with the aimless drifting he had been doing for 3 years, and that he thought Redemption Flats might be a place worth staying in. She had said she thought so too. He had told her, on a crisp October evening walk, that he was thinking about whether there was land he could buy on the edge of town, a piece with enough land for a modest house and a small operation. She had looked at the middle distance with an expression of focused consideration and said she thought a house would be very fine and that she would want a room with a south-facing window for reading. He bought her a ring from a silversmith who came through Redemption Flats in early October, a quiet man of Navajo and Mexican heritage named Segundo who did beautiful work, and who made the ring from silver and turquoise. The stone, a deep blue-green that he told Nelson was called Sky Stone by some of the Pueblo people, who believed it held something of the sky in it. On the last Sunday morning of October, they walked up to the eastern ridge as was their custom, and the morning was the kind of October morning the territory offered as a gift, cold and still, and the sunrise coming up in streaks of copper and rose above the mountains, the air so clean it felt like drinking from a cold stream. They sat on the flat boulder with their coffee and watched the light come in and talked a little and were quiet a little, and when the sky had settled from the drama of the sunrise into its daytime blue, he set down his coffee cup and turned to face her. She looked at him and read something in his face, and she was very still and very attentive. "I have something to ask you," he said, "and I think you probably know what it is." "I think I do," she said, with a small, steady smile. He took the ring out of his coat pocket and held it in his palm. The turquoise caught the morning light and did what Segundo had promised it would do, which was to look, somehow, like a piece of sky. "Opal Blackwell," he said, "I have spent 3 years telling myself that certain parts of me were done with the business of hoping and wanting and reaching for things. And then I sat down next to you on a horse trough wall in the dark, and everything I had told myself turned out to be wrong, which is the best I have ever been wrong in my life." He looked at her, at this woman he had come to love fully and specifically, and without reservation. "I would like to spend the rest of my life being wrong about things with you if you'll have me. Will you marry me?" She looked at him for a moment, and her eyes were bright in the morning light, and she said, "Yes, Nelson, I will absolutely marry you." He put the ring on her finger, and she looked at it for a moment, at the silver and the turquoise, and then she looked at him and leaned forward and kissed him, her cold morning lips and her warm heart and his hands holding her face gently in the way of a man who understands what he has been given. When they pulled apart, she said, with the small, dry amusement that was so entirely her, "I want to be clear that I would have asked you in another month if you had waited any longer." "I don't doubt it," he said. "Good," she said. "We understand each other." "We do," he said. "We have for some time." They were married in the first week of December, in the little church that listed to the south, which had been decorated by Mrs. Hooper and several women from the town, with pine boughs and winter flowers that someone had managed to find at some effort and expense, because Mrs. Hooper believed that a wedding deserved the physical evidence of intention. Reverend Marsh, who was a small, kind man who had married a fair number of people on the frontier, and understood that a ceremony here meant something different than it might back east, because it was harder one and more deliberate, conducted the service with both brevity and warmth. Hector Calloway stood on Nelson's side, which was both an honor and an indication of how the old rancher felt about the people in his life when they were worth something to him. Emilio stood there too, young and beaming and dressed in his very best, and when the moment came for the ring, he produced it from his pocket with the precise care of someone who has rehearsed this moment several times. Mrs. Hooper sat in the front pew and cried with the uncomplicated fullness of a woman who thought crying at weddings was the appropriate response and saw no reason to hold back. Several of Opal's students were there with their families, including young Thomas and Rosie, and they sat in the pews with the concentrated attention of children witnessing, something they understood to be important without quite having the words for why. Opal wore a dress that she and Mrs. Hooper had made together over several weeks in November, a deep cream with modest embroidery at the collar that was understated and elegant and entirely her own sensibility. And she walked down the aisle of the listing church with her chin up and her eyes on Nelson, and a look on her face that he would remember for the rest of his life, which was a look that contained everything: happiness and honesty, and the full weight of a serious choice freely made. When Reverend Marsh asked if there was any impediment and received silence from the assembled 30-some people of Redemption Flats, the silence itself felt like a gift. And when Nelson said "I do" and Opal said "I do," they said it to each other, eye to eye, because that was how they did things. The party afterward was at the Sutton house, which Gerhardt Sutton had opened entirely for the evening, and which Mrs. Sutton had filled with food enough for twice the number of people. Someone produced a fiddle and someone else produced a guitar, and there was dancing that went until the cold of the December evening finally pushed through the building's warmth and reminded everyone that it was late and the territory did not heat itself for sentiment. Nelson danced with his wife in the small space that had been cleared between the tables, and she was a good dancer, unsurprisingly, practical and light, and he was not a bad one, and they moved together with the ease of people who had learned each other's rhythms over months of walking and talking and sitting side by side on sunlit boulders, and it felt like the physical expression of everything they had built together, natural and unhurried and good. When the party wound down and the last of the guests had gone, and the December cold was full outside, they walked to the small house they had been preparing for the past month, a house on the northeast edge of town, on a quarter-acre of land that Nelson had purchased in November with his saved wages, and a loan from Hector Calloway at terms that were generous to the point of being a wedding gift in themselves. The house was modest, 2 rooms and a kitchen, but it was soundly built, and it had a south-facing window in what would be the reading room, which Nelson had put there specifically, and which Opal had seen on her first viewing of the half-finished house, and had looked at for a long, quiet moment before turning to him with an expression that had made everything worth it. They walked in the cold December night through Redemption Flats, and the town was quiet, and the stars were the extravagant stars of the territory, and Opal's hand was in the crook of Nelson's arm, and they did not talk because there was nothing that needed saying, and they went into their house and shut the door on the cold night, and it was the beginning of the life they were going to build together. The winter of 1874 into 1875 was cold but manageable, the kind of winter that requires effort and preparation but rewards both. Nelson continued working for Hector Calloway through the winter months, though the nature of the work shifted with the season to maintenance, mucking stalls, mending equipment, helping with the cattle in the cold spells. He had also begun, on his own time, to develop a small piece of the land adjacent to their house, clearing scrub and assessing the soil with the expertise of a farmer's son, and thinking about what might grow there when the season turned. Opal taught through the winter, and the school filled with cold morning children who came in stamping snow or mud off their boots and sat by the small stove and learned arithmetic and reading, and the history of a country that was, in 1875, still very much in the process of determining what it was going to be. She had by now a routine with her students that was genuinely effective, built on the understanding that children on the frontier were practical people by necessity, and that education which connected to the world they actually lived in was education that stuck. She had also, by the spring of 1875, gathered a group of the women in town, including Mrs. Hooper and several of the ranchers' wives, for a formal letter-writing campaign to the territorial legislature about the conditions of the schools in the territory, which were chronically underfunded and unevenly distributed, particularly for the children of Navajo and other indigenous families who had very little access to formal schooling, and whose presence in the schools that did exist was complicated by the territory's own tangled politics around such matters. It was characteristic of Opal that she took this on not with the enthusiasm of someone discovering a cause, but with the focused practicality of someone who had seen a problem and determined it was worth addressing systematically. She was not naive about what the letter writing would accomplish in the immediate term, But she believed, and said so, that the record of people making their concerns known was itself a form of pressure that accumulated over time, and that doing nothing was not a neutral choice. Nelson admired this about her without much surprise anymore, because he had come to understand that her moral seriousness was not separate from the rest of her character, but was simply the shape it naturally took, the same quality that made her ask real questions and say real things and sit beside strangers in the dark and be honest with them. He told her one evening, watching her at the table with her pen and her paper and her particular look of focused determination, that he thought she was probably going to outlast every institution she ever took issue with through sheer patient persistence. She looked up and said, "That is my intent." "I know," he said. "I find it extremely attractive." She smiled and looked back at her paper. "Good," she said. "Now let me finish this paragraph." The spring of 1875 brought rain, actual honest rain, which the territory accepted with a kind of stunned gratitude, and the land greened in ways that even the long-timers said was unusual and beautiful. Nelson planted a garden behind the house, building on the cleared patch of ground he had been working since winter, and planted vegetables with a care that went back to his roots in Illinois and forward into a future he could now see clearly. He planted tomatoes and squash and beans, and a small patch of sunflowers along the fence because Opal had mentioned once that she liked sunflowers, and he had stored the information with the attention he gave to things that mattered. When the sunflowers came up in May, tall and ungainly and completely gold in the afternoon light, she stood in the garden and looked at them for a moment, and then she looked at him. And the look was the particular one that did not need words but that he had learned to read perfectly. The look that meant she saw him and appreciated exactly what had been meant and was grateful not just for the gesture, but for the fact of being known. He had, by this point, bought a horse of his own, a good-tempered bay gelding he named Ajax after the Greek hero in the book Opal had lent him over the winter, which she thought was both appropriate and gently amusing. He rode Ajax out to the Callaway Ranch and home again each day, and on certain evenings he and Opal would saddle the bay and the smaller roan mare she had acquired in the fall, and ride out across the land in the long May evenings when the light lasted until nearly 9 o'clock, and the land smelled of sage and wet earth, and something that had no name, but was simply the smell of the territory being alive. They would ride out to the eastern ridge sometimes, and sit on the horses at the top and watch the light change over the mountains. And Nelson would think about the man he had been the previous spring, sitting there alone and telling himself that a man with hands as ruined as his had no right to reach for anything worth keeping. And he would look at his wife beside him and feel something that was gratitude and wonder, and a quiet, complete happiness that he had not previously understood was still available to him. On a warm evening in June of 1875, Opal told him that she was expecting their first child. She told him in the kitchen after supper, setting down her coffee cup and looking at him with a composure that he recognized as the thing she put on when she was feeling something very large and did not quite know where to begin, and she said, "I went to see Dr. Henshaw yesterday. I wanted to be certain before I said anything." A pause. "We're going to have a baby, Nelson. Around January, he thinks." He sat for a moment with the words, and then he stood up and crossed the kitchen and took her in his arms, and she let herself be held in the way she rarely fully allowed, with the particular surrender of someone putting down something heavy for a moment, and he held her and felt the realness of it, the extraordinary, improbable, completely logical fact of it, that this was happening, that this was his life. "January," he said against her hair. "January," she confirmed. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "A little tired," she said, "a little amazed, a lot amazed actually." "Me too," he said, "a lot amazed." She pulled back enough to look at his face, and she read what she found there with the accuracy she brought to everything, and she said, "You're happy." "I am," he said, "completely and genuinely and without any qualification. I'm happy." She smiled, the full one, and leaned back against him, and they stood in the kitchen of their small house in Redemption Flats, while the summer evening came in through the open window carrying the smell of the garden and the far-off mountains, and it was the kind of moment that a person who has come through real darkness knows to hold with both hands. The pregnancy went well, as these things went in 1875 in the territory. Dr. Henshaw was a competent and careful man, and Opal was constitutionally honest about how she was feeling and did not downplay discomfort or difficulty, which made it easier to address things as they arose. Mrs. Hooper appointed herself a kind of informal guardian of the situation, appearing at the house with food and practical advice at intervals calibrated to be helpful rather than intrusive, because she understood the difference. Nelson found himself doing things he had not done since the Kansas farm, small domestic attentions, fixing the loose board on the front step before she tripped on it, making certain the wood pile was stacked well before the cold came, thinking about the second room of the house and what it would take to make it properly ready for a baby. He did these things with the simple purposefulness of a man who has been given something to build toward and is grateful for the direction. Emilio, who had come to dinner twice and had clearly developed an enormous affection for both of them as a couple, announced at the second dinner that he was certain it would be a boy and that the boy should be named after someone heroic. "We'll take that under consideration," Opal told him. "Ajax is already taken," Nelson added. "By the horse," Emilio said, as though this settled something. "By the horse," Nelson agreed. Their son was born on the 14th of January, 1876, in the bedroom of the small house, with Dr. Henshaw in attendance and Mrs. Hooper in the kitchen making so much coffee, and being so forcefully calm that she practically constituted a medical resource in her own right. The birth was hard in the way that births are hard, requiring all the strength that Opal had built over a lifetime of practical effort and honest living. And Nelson sat where he was allowed to sit and held her hand, and said what could be said, and was witness to something he had not the words for, and would not have for a very long time. The boy arrived in the early morning, just as the winter sun was beginning to come up pale and cold over the eastern mountains, and he announced himself with a full-voiced objection to the cold air that made Dr. Henshaw say, with dry satisfaction, "Good strong lungs on this one." And Mrs. Hooper appeared in the doorway with an expression of absolutely unconstrained joy and had to press her handkerchief to her face. Nelson held his son, the small, urgent weight of him, and looked at this person they had made, red-faced and furious about existence and entirely perfect, and he could not speak for a moment, could not do anything but hold him and understand that whatever he had been before, he was something larger now. "James," Opal said from the bed, her voice tired and clear. "I want to call him James." Nelson looked at her, and she looked back at him with the particular honesty of a woman who has just done something immense and knows it, and is not going to pretend otherwise. James had been the name of her father, who had died when she was 17, and whom she had been trying to honor quietly for her whole life. "James," Nelson said. "Yes, that's exactly right." They named him James Arthur Wells, Arthur for Nelson's father, and he grew up in Redemption Flats with the particular confidence of a child who is loved specifically and well, who knows his parents' names and faces and the exact quality of their attention, who grows up understanding that a family is built by deliberate choice and sustained by daily choosing. The spring of 1876 was good. The territory was changing as it changed every year, more people coming in, more roads being made, the telegraph reaching further, the conversation about statehood and governance and law becoming louder and more urgent. Redemption Flats grew a little, new families arriving, a second general store opening on the south end of the main street. Opal returned to teaching in April, making arrangements with Mrs. Hooper, who could see no higher use of her afternoons than watching James Wells sleep and wake, and perform the specific miracles of infancy, and Hector Calloway's wife, a quiet woman named Eleanor who had taken a decided liking to Opal, and whom Opal liked in return with the equitable warmth she gave to people who were worth it. Nelson had, by the end of 1876, purchased a small additional parcel of land adjacent to their property and begun a more formal small ranching operation, a dozen cattle and some chickens, and the beginning of a second fence line that meant something. That meant he was putting down roots in the language that this land understood, which was the language of permanence and commitment, and the willingness to maintain something over time. Hector, observing this, offered Nelson a more formal arrangement as a partner in the Callaway Ranch's management, a recognition of the years of reliable work and the judgment Nelson had shown in the land dispute and in general. Nelson accepted, and it meant a steady income that went beyond day wages and a stake in something larger. And it meant Emilio, who had become something like the little brother Nelson had never had, was now technically his professional partner in certain undertakings, which Emilio found enormously satisfying and said so frequently. By the summer of 1877, James Wells was walking with the determined instability of a toddler who has recently discovered this capability and intends to use it on every surface available. He was a dark-haired boy with his mother's eyes and his father's jaw, and a personality that seemed to combine Opal's directness with Nelson's careful steadiness in a ratio that was entirely his own. He was extremely interested in everything, a quality both parents found delightful and occasionally exhausting. Opal was expecting again, and this time they knew it earlier, and Opal managed it with the same practical, unhurried attention she gave to everything. And on a cold November morning in 1877, their daughter arrived, a girl they named Clara Opal Wells. Nelson had asked simply if that was all right, if the name Clara would mean something good rather than something sad, and Opal had held the name in her consideration for a quiet moment and said, "Yes, I think it means we're grateful. I think it means she's remembered. I think that's exactly right." Clara Opal Wells was a calm baby, serious-faced and observant from her earliest weeks, and as she grew, she proved to have a quality of stillness that was remarkable in a child, the ability to sit and watch and absorb that suggested she was taking notes on the world around her for later reference. James regarded his sister with an initial suspicion that gave way, over the course of several weeks, to a provisional acceptance, and then, by the time she was pulling herself up on things and moving around the house, to a loyal and somewhat imperious protectiveness that made both her parents quietly fond and slightly amused. Redemption Flats in the late 1870s was a town that was finding its shape, still rough in the ways that frontier towns are rough, still carrying the weight of the territory's complicated history, the land disputes and the law's uneven reach, and the ongoing, unresolved questions about what belonging to this place would ultimately mean for all its different peoples. But it was also a town with a school that was doing real work, with a church that on certain Sundays managed to be more than the sum of its listingness, with a doctor and a blacksmith and a general store, and the Sutton House, where Gerhardt still put linens on the tables on Friday evenings as an act of stubborn civilization, and with families, among them one in a house on the northeast edge with a south-facing reading window and sunflowers along the fence, who had made their lives there with intention and were not going anywhere. Nelson and Opal had found what they needed from each other and built what they needed around it, a life that was not without difficulty or sorrow or the ordinary grind of hard seasons and harder work, but that was in every essential way full of purpose and of love, and of the particular, daily, unremarkable beauty of two people who have chosen each other clearly and go on choosing each other in the small actions of every ordinary day. On Sunday mornings, when the children were old enough to be brought along and then old enough to walk it themselves, they would still go to the eastern ridge and watch the sun come up over the mountains. James would throw rocks into the valley below with the focused energy of a boy who cannot sit still for sunrises, and Clara would sit between her parents on the flat boulder and look at the mountains with her particular, serious attention, And Nelson would put his arm around Opal, and she would lean against him in the easy, unself-conscious way of people who have been beside each other long enough that the contact is as natural as breathing. He had thought, once, sitting on this same ridge before any of it had happened, that a man with hands as ruined as his had no right to reach for anything worth keeping. He had been wrong about that, he now knew, with a thoroughness that was not painful but was instead deeply, quietly good. The scarring was still there, in the way that loss always leaves its mark, but it had become something he carried differently now, not as a weight that prevented movement but as part of the texture of who he was, the evidence of having lived and loved and lost and unexpectedly and entirely loved again. He had thought he was too scarred from the past to start again. And then she had sat beside him, first at the edge of town in the dark, and then at sunrise on the ridge, and everything he had told himself had turned out, profoundly and permanently, to be wrong. The territory moved on, as territories do, toward statehood and growth and all the complexity that comes with both. The children grew. James became a serious, bright boy who loved mathematics the way his mother loved books, and who spent his adolescence arguing with Emilio, who remained in their lives with the tenacity of a man who considers himself family and intends to be treated accordingly, about the best way to manage cattle in a dry year. Clara became a quiet, perceptive young woman with her grandmother's name and her mother's eyes, and a talent for drawing that nobody had anticipated and everybody found extraordinary when she produced, at age 12, a detailed charcoal study of the view from the eastern ridge that captured the mountains and the sky and the particular quality of the morning light with an accuracy that made Opal hold it for a long, still moment, and then set it carefully on the mantel where it stayed for the rest of their lives. Nelson Wells, the man who had come to Redemption Flats with nothing more than worn tools and a heart he had told himself was out of use, died at the age of 67 in the summer of 1910, in the house with the south-facing reading window, with his children grown and present and his wife's hand in his, and there was nothing unresolved between them, no word unsaid that needed saying, no accounting left open. He had lived fully and loved well, and built something real in the good ground of a life he had almost refused to ask for. Opal Blackwell Wells, who had sat beside a quiet, scarred man on a wall in the dark, and then on a boulder in the sunrise, and had looked at him with her honest eyes and seen exactly what she was looking at, outlived him by 9 years, teaching until she was 70, writing letters to the Territorial Education Board until the territory became a state, and she wrote to the state board instead, and never once in all those years stopped finding the view from the eastern ridge worth walking up to see. She is buried beside him in the small cemetery on the north side of Redemption Flats, which by 1919 had grown into something that was almost a city, or at least a very serious town, and on the stone above them the children had put their names and the dates, and beneath that a line from a letter Opal had written to James in the last year of her life, when he asked her what she thought the most important thing she had ever done was. She had written back, "I sat beside someone in the dark when it might have been easier not to. Everything good that followed came from that," which was true and was enough and was the whole of the story.